Welcome back to the State of Play. Now, in our middle game, if you are into military stuff, the 2020 Armed Forces Week and Armed Forces Day were nothing short of breathtaking. There was endless boom and bang, the synchronized thumping of boots on the ground, the Gripens and Hawks tearing up the skies above Bulukwane, the Roy Falk spitting fire, and endless columns of military vehicles from the infantry, engineer corps, and health services. Take a look. But this show-stopping display of power belies the true state of the SANDF. So dire is the funding crunch there that some have likened it to the next ESCOM, an organization on the brink of collapse with ghastly consequences for us as a nation. What am I talking about? A budget of 50 billion rand a year means the Defence Force is 23% underfunded and declining. Pilots are not spending as much time as they should be to keep them battle ready, and sailors are not taking to the seas as much as they should be as well. So tonight we put the magnifying glass on the state of the SANDF and its critical funding crisis. All right, the Defence Minister, Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, who was meant to have been our guest this evening, has been raising the alarm on this issue for the past few years to no avail. Last year, she warned that the SANDF is becoming progressively more unsustainable and that we risk the irreversible damage to the Defence Force as a whole. So, with her counterpart at Treasury glancing over his allocations one more time before presentation on Wednesday, what ought to happen to avert what could possibly be the worsening disaster for the SANDF. I'm joined via Skype by Darren Olivier, who is Director of African Defence Review. So, Darren, we may have been impressed by all the boom and bang during the South African Armed Forces Week and Armed Forces Day parades, but does that give us any glimpse into the strength and capability of the SANDF?
You know, to some extent it does. It tells us that the sharp end is still quite sharp, and that despite the underfunding, the combat units are still maintain a very high level of capability and professionalism. However, you can't ignore the effect of years and years of underfunding. And as you said earlier, the Defence Force is at least 23% underfunded. And what this means long term is that it's effectively your operational funding, so the funding you have for flight hours, for sea hours, for just training exercises, tends to be crowded out by your fixed cost, your personnel cost, your base costs, and all the rest. So it does tell us that there's still something to save. The force is still very good. Considering the underfunding, but it is, to me, it's a warning sign that we must change something, and whether that's to increase funding or to downsize the force is a decision that must be made.
Yeah. So, Darren, give me a sense then, how do you sell that story to someone who says, hey, we are not a country at war. If there's any war that we are facing, it's the war on unemployment, on poverty, and the lack of economic growth. Why do you guys want us to shift spending towards the Defence Force in peace times?
That's absolutely a fair question. I mean, this is the old guns versus butter debate. And there's no doubt that when it comes to spending on the military versus spending on housing, police, healthcare in South Africa, the military must come second. And in fact, that is the basis on which military planning currently exists. It's the idea that human security, which is the ability to have a very high level of socioeconomic growth in South Africa, is by far the most important priority. So the military has to fit within whatever's left over, in effect, and kind of play that very careful balancing act where it has enough capabilities to preserve certain skills, certain abilities, and be able to plan for the long term, because obviously you can't really foresee threats up to 20, 30 years in the future, but it takes that long to maintain a capability, while also being able to not cost too much. So currently the level is, I think, too low. The SANDF budget is about 3% of government spending, less than 1% of our GDP, which is not ideal. Another problem with that, though, is that the SANDF also supports a fair amount of our high-tech industry. So we're talking about companies like Aerosol, like Denel, like Paramount, where it's a sector of the economy that in general provides itself high-quality employment and high-skilled employment. And that should also not be ignored whenever we discuss defense spending. So yes, it's a very tough argument to make. The old adage is that the military is like an insurance policy. Nobody wants to spend it when everything's fine. But the moment your house burns down, you're happy you spent it. So yes, it has to be a very careful balance. And what people are calling for is not necessarily a huge increase in spending. It's a relatively small increase, phased in over a number of years, which does not itself crowd out more important spending on healthcare and the rest.
Sure.
That being said, though, the alternative is to downsize the SANDF. But then that means as well that you lose the ability to do things like maritime patrol, search and rescue, border control, for example, which is also acceptable, but it's a choice.
So as you say that then, and in conclusion, Darren, then, what would be the consequences of not turning this curve around the spending on the SANDF? Because as you and I speak, it's on a decline. That was part of the medium-term expenditure framework of about 3 years ago. In fact, it's about to get even rougher because by my reading of the estimates of national expenditure, it should be cut by a further 5 billion rand within the next year or so. What would be the consequences that some have likened to, the ESCOM in 2008, where you're saying, was it 1998, where you're saying later on we'll be saying, we told you so?
Sure. It won't be quite like ESCOM because the Defence Force, like any government department, uses zero-based budgeting. So it can't per se go bankrupt because every year it starts again from zero. The real issue you're going to have is that it is less and less able to fulfill certain duties. So, for example, what's currently being cut the most is the budget for acquiring new systems, both new systems and spare parts for current ones. So what happens then is that it means that as the defense budgets get smaller and smaller and smaller and more goes to personnel, it's less able to maintain the trucks, the APCs, the tanks, the aircraft, the ships, and all the rest, which means that it'll be forced to eventually retire some types. So, for example, the Royal will be retired at some point, or the C-130s. And what that means then is that you then lose the ability to have that capability now and the ability to then use that. So it isn't so much that you're going to have a total collapse. What you're going to have is a gradual degradation in the ability to do certain tasks, which is still very dire. So, I mean, I would definitely argue that the status quo can't continue. Because we really don't want to lose these capabilities without any kind of managed process.
Yeah. All right, Darren Olivier, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And you're right there. I mean, the ability to maintain some of the equipment is already coming under pressure, including those frigates that were purchased as part of what was known then as the Strategic Defence Procurement Package, better known to you and I as the arms deal. Darren Olivier there joining us from the Netherlands. Well, when we return, I give you my take on the recent shenanigans in Parliament and whether or not the EFF filibustering strategy is corroding Parliament, as some have argued.